Well, let's head to the US now, and joining me is Louis DeCipio, Professor of Political Science at the University of California, and seeing that we've just seen the piece on the life of Jimmy Carter, 100 years old, quite a life, and as Annalise mentioned, his greatest achievements happened beyond his presidency.
He successfully defined what a post-president should be. Somebody doing good works throughout the world, using his ability to raise funds to help people directly, eradicating an illness in his case. His post-presidency was remarkable, and his presidency, I think, was more successful than people give him credit for. He was the president that the United States needed at the end of the Watergate and Vietnam eras, and he served in that role.
A real change of subject, and the aftermath of New Orleans has everyone on tenterhooks.
Without question. The fact that New Orleans was followed very quickly by Las Vegas, and seemingly they're completely unrelated, has people concerned that public areas might not be safe, and that the U.S. involvement in actions abroad is causing U.S. citizens to act in a dangerous sort of way. Obviously, we don't know fully what happened in New Orleans, but we know that it was a tragedy. And, a night that should have been a celebration ended up in horror.
It's a very unsettled scene that Donald Trump is emerging into, isn't it, as he heads back to the White House?
Without question. And, the activity, what happened in New Orleans and maybe what happened in Las Vegas is primarily the responsibility of local police, something that President Trump won't have responsibility for when he assumes the presidency. But people look to the president to be a leader. And President-elect Trump is erratic in that role. Sometimes he can speak to the nation. Other times he speaks to his own issues and concerns.
Elon Musk, he continues to ruffle feathers. It's going to be very interesting to see where his role is during the presidency. He seems to be taking on MAGA head on with the whole immigration thing.
Well, at least a piece of immigration. You're absolutely right. The question of whether the United States should admit skilled workers and perhaps some unskilled workers on short-term visas. Clearly, this is something that's very important to Mr. Musk's enterprises and to others in the sort of corporate wing of the Trump coalition. But President Trump ran on a promise to, he overstated this, to end immigration. So how he threads that needle between what corporate America needs, which is more skilled immigrants, and what the MAGA base may think Trump meant, which is to slow or perhaps stop immigration, is an open question. Then there's also the personal dynamic. How long will President-elect Trump or President Trump like having somebody that's getting almost as much publicity as he is, as Mr. Musk seems able to do?
Now, the story that's playing out this morning with the vote for the House Speaker, how do you think this is going to unfold? Because it's interesting to watch.
It really is, and it's a tragedy, and I don't use that term incautiously, that the Republicans are willing to play this game with a position as important as the speakership. It's not just a ceremonial role. The House of Representatives, the People's House, cannot do anything, swear in members, open up the Capitol to honor former President Carter with his state viewing without a speaker. The speaker is also the second in line to the presidency. We need that office filled, and a handful of Republicans are willing to play games to block that. So far, I think Speaker Johnson has the upper hand. The first vote seems to be going against him, but at least when I began this interview, it wasn't formally closed. My suspicion is that a compromise will be reached within the next day or two, but we shouldn't even have to wait that long. We need a speaker, and Speaker Johnson clearly has the support of most of the Republicans.
And just finally, he's done a pretty good job, hasn't he, really? He took the role at a very tumultuous time.
He's done a fine job with a narrow House, and the way he's done a fine job is he's looked across the aisle when he's absolutely needed to, so that the government is funded and so that the debt ceiling is raised. That's the job of a statesman. Yeah. And the handful of Republicans who are opposing him don't want a statesman, they want a bomb thrower. And Speaker Johnson has shown that he is not going to fill that role. Good on you, Louis. Always good to chat. Thank you so much. My pleasure. Happy New Year.
Now, US President Joe Biden will travel to New Orleans next week in the wake of this week's terror attack. The FBI says it believes the terrorist suspect was inspired by ISIS, as James Matthews explains.
Hot gumbo.
Bourbon Street back in business.
Hot jambalaya.
14 flowers remembered 14 victims. So did patrons in prayer. Supporters in town for a college football game did it their way.
Terrorism is not going to stop us from living.
Metal wedges are now on pavements that a terrorist used to steer around temporary barricades. 36 hours on, 36 hours too late. Newly released camera footage shows a fresh angle on the incident as it unfolded, the chaos and the carnage. The FBI's latest assessment is that the attacker Shamsuddin Jabbar acted alone, and that there was no connection between the New Orleans attack and an exploding Tesla Cybertruck in Las Vegas. They've released images of Jabbar in the street just over an hour before he carried out his attack, and a picture of one of the coolers he placed containing an improvised explosive device. And they've told how he posted videos to social media on his way to commit murder and spoke of his support for ISIS.
In the first video, Jabbar explains he originally planned to harm his family and friends, but was concerned the news headlines would not focus on the, quote, war between the believers and the disbelievers, end quote.
They'd worked overnight to clear Bourbon Street, where a terrorist murder ended when he crashed into a crane and was shot dead. Questions persist about the security measures that failed to prevent mass murder. Questions we put to the New Orleans police chief. Madam, do you acknowledge that you let the victims down by not having an appropriate security plan?
Oh, that's not correct. That's not correct. We would disagree with that. We had a
plan that allowed an attacker to drive into a crowd.
And I take exception to that, and I do not agree with that.
It has to be a failure.
We do know that people have lost their lives, but if you're experienced with terrorism, you would not be asking that question.
Well, with respect, experience of terrorism surely requires appropriate security protection. We are learning more about the victims, people who'd come to party in the centre of New Orleans and crossed a terrorist path.
The last thing that we ever said to each other, he told me he loved me, so.
Jack Besh lost his brother Martin, nicknamed Tiger, here on the left. He made a FaceTime call to an emergency room as doctors fought but failed to save his brother.
He couldn't respond to any of us, but he could hear us. I truly believe he could hear us. His eyes were closed and he was on a machine, but I know he could hear us. God kept his heartbeat beating for a reason, and I believe it was so that me and my family could tell him goodbye. You couldn't even fit in the room. There were so many doctors in there. And they said they did everything they possibly could, and he fought so hard. God was calling him home.
It is the iconic street, the old part of New Orleans in the fabled French Quarter. Bourbon Street has the rich associations of this city's past. Its music, its culture, entertainment. Bourbon Street is the best of New Orleans. Here, sadly, they have seen its worst. James Matthews, Sky News, in Bourbon Street, New Orleans.
I hate to say this, but it feels like 2020 all over again. Overflowing hospitals and thousands of patients with flu-like symptoms. China is facing a new health crisis, a new disease outbreak, which looks a lot like the Wuhan virus. And as always, Beijing is sharing no information. They're calling it a pneumonia of unknown origin. That's how Chinese authorities have described it. Beijing says it has set up systems to monitor the outbreak. If you feel like you've heard this before, you have. From the same China, some 4 years back. They're making it sound like it's just the flu season. We do hope it's just that. But sadly, the pictures tell a different story. Take a look at this. This is believed to be from a hospital in China. We cannot verify these pictures, but several videos like this one are going viral. Clearly, there is more to the story. We do not wish to speculate and feed the fear, but here is what we know so far. This is not a new disease. Experts say that China is dealing with an outbreak of HMPV. That's the human metapneumovirus, HMPV. This virus has been around for at least 60 years. It is quite common and easy to catch. So unlike the Wuhan virus, this time they seem to be dealing with a known disease, and yet there are reasons to be worried. The first reason is the scale of the outbreak. It is massive. Cases have been reported in multiple cities across China: Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei, Shaanxi, and Inner Mongolia. These 5 areas have reported the highest number of cases. But we don't know about the actual caseload. As usual, China has not shared any data, so we don't know how much worse it could become. The second reason to be worried is the nature of the patients. HMPV attacks the younger sections of the population, the children and adolescents. They are the most vulnerable to contracting this virus, and a large number of patients right now are also children. Plus, treatment is also challenging because just like the Wuhan virus, the HMPV is a respiratory disease. There is no drug to treat it. There are no vaccines either. And the symptoms are similar: fever, cough, and shortness of breath. That's what HMPV patients have. In severe cases, they can develop other complications like bronchitis or pneumonia. So they may need intensive care, oxygen, or even a ventilator. Again, does this sound familiar to you? We all know what happens when hospitals are overwhelmed, when there are too many patients to treat and not enough resources, when oxygen supplies are about to run out, when patients cannot find beds for treatment. HMPV is not the same as the Wuhan virus, but it can easily wreak havoc on the health system. China knows this too. In fact, its hospitals are already feeling the strain. Despite that, it refuses to come clean about the outbreak or its scale. It seems to have learned nothing from the last pandemic. It remains in a state of denial. Just look at this story. It came out 3 days back. The World Health Organization, or WHO, made an appeal to Beijing. It has asked China to come clean about the Wuhan virus pandemic. The WHO has sought data from Beijing. And how did Beijing respond? With a denial.
On the issue of COVID-19 traceability, China has always upheld the spirit of scientific openness and transparency as it actively supported participation in the global scientific traceability methods. At the same time, we firmly oppose any form of political manipulation. China's openness and transparency have exceeded expectations.
They say they have exceeded expectations. Does the WHO agree with that? In 2023, a WHO official was asked about this. He said, and I quote, "China's lack of data disclosure is simply inexcusable." And this is a sharp shift in the stand of the World Health Organization. In the early days of the pandemic, they had praised China's response to the Wuhan virus. We all know what a disaster it turned out to be. The world cannot afford a repeat of the same mistake. It must remain vigilant about China's latest disease outbreak.